The clouds were rolling in. The bright blue sky was receding rapidly as the sun cast its warming rays, and the glory of a perfect day was stripped by the sudden oncoming storm. The wild winds from the rapid change in temperature blew in every direction, whipping smaller plant life in violent fashions and shearing the branches off trees. Wildlife ran for cover as though a hunter was on the prowl, and innocence vanished into the thickets of the dying forests. The last signs of sunlight breached through the porous holes of the clouds above, painting the world in a mellow sepia tone. It was beautiful, but for a moment, until the gold had faded into orange and the orange glow of our world turned into the harshest of reds, before the color of life was snuffed out entirely. She was at my side. "You're the cause of this, Derek. The sun fades because of you." "I know," I wept. I only knew this because I was told this my entire life. As the plant life around me decayed, as though shifting through centuries of time and the rolling clouds in the sky sunk closer to the surface of Earth, I closed my eyes. "All because of you, Derek. Mankind will rot." I would have cried, but at that point the tears were running dry, and I had no more to spare. I could feel the stiffness in my limbs. My body was locked. I was trapped. Paralysis. "Derek, wake up! Time for school! Damn it, Derek, I'm gonna beat your ass!" I could hear Kristen's voice, but I was not permitted to see just yet. I waved and flailed violently, but it wasn't my body I was feeling. I was still far off from this reality. The world I was in had shattered, and a great tunnel funneling vibrant waves of air, circulating as though constructed entirely of etheric energy, funneled me towards my body until I crashed into the silent ambient air that was within my room. It was like floating towards my body in slow motion, and every movement was painstakingly difficult. I sat patiently within my body, as I knew it had to end sometime. My feeling would return the moment my conscience had arrived. The familiar vibrations began to fade from my limbs as the sensation of feeling returned. The loud reverberations that I could hear within my head receded to the back of my mind, and felt as though they were escaping from my cranium, only to be replaced by my thoughts in an endless streaming internal dialogue. I flicked but a single finger, and I was free. I jumped up as quickly as I could. "Jesus, Derek, what are you trying to do, scare me?" Kristen asked, as I looked down at a necklace that I insisted on wearing even to bed. It was a habit. "No," I answered, now satisfied with my reality check. I was awake. And that's for sure. "And what the hell is this?" Kristen held up a piece of cloth that I hardly recognized. It was my shirt from the other day that apparently stretched when it was yanked upon by the 8th grade bear man. "Did you rip another shirt?" I hesitated. Just get up," Christine demanded as she swatted the back of my head and ripped at the sheets to my bed to get them set for the day. Kristen shared a similar hair color as mine, but a bit darker, which brought it to a deeper brown. Her hair was obviously longer as well, just drifting past her shoulders in natural flow as she wasn't fond of tying it up into exotic knots. That wasn't to say my hair wasn't long, as it was typically lengthier than that of the average male, thanks to my sister's preference of having me grow it out at a younger age for her to play with. It grew on me, to say the least, and I kept it at a decent length, but not long enough to skew my male image. It fell a little past my brows at the front and comfortably covered most of my ears. I dearly wished it would block out the sound of my nagging sister in moments like this. I leapt out of bed and began scrounging around for the clothing that was scattered among the room from the night before. The textures were strange to me, and the feel of gravity was nauseating. When I went to bend down, I nearly fell over and held my hand out to balance myself against the wall. Kristen was busy with the bedding. I figured I could buy some time. "Take it slow," I told myself. The rug below me looked as though it was hovering but a few inches above the floor, and I tried hard to get it back into place. I had to make things right again. "Derek!" she shouted, looking down at me, dissatisfied that I still wasn't dressed. "I'm going. I'm just tired," I said, as I tried to play it off. It was far from the truth. My sleep was restful, I'm sure, but returning was never easy, and my movements, vision, even thoughts resembled that of my father on the rare occasion I bumped into him when I wasn't around my sister. "Yeah, well, good. You can go to bed a half an hour early tonight and see if that'll help." She was very good at ruining my day. I ran down the stairs and stopped at the bottom as I looked over into the living room where scattered beer cans tiled the floor like some elaborate art project. I stepped closer to them and curiously tilted my head. There was a face made with the pattern of cans. Perhaps an eye or two? A smile? I would normally say to assume such randomly laid beer cans composed such a detailed picture was a clear state of delusion, and that would be true, had there not have been a photograph at its center. She was gorgeous, my mother. How could I blame my father's regret? Normally at that hour my stomach would have been grumbling for some grub, but I wasn't really feeling it. Assuming I was hungry anyways, I made food my next objective. I ran into the kitchen and climbed up one of the tall stools aligning the perimeter of the dining room counter. When I reached the top, I witnessed a delicious entree before me. Okay, maybe I was hungry. Well, knowing it was made by my sister quickly changed the facts, but nonetheless, a breakfast buffet was splayed across the countertop surface, calling to my attention. I scrambled to requisition all the food that I could for myself before any of my sister's guests decided to do the same. As if reading my mind, I heard heavy footsteps coming down the stairs, guided by a hungover mind. A stool was pulled out next to me, and a stranger had clumsily plopped down. I was too deeply consumed into eating to notice who it was. "Hey, Derek," said the girl who sat down next to me. Her lack of sleep clearly displayed under her eyes. She was much older than me, and I wasn't particularly of the age that would allow me to decipher the attractiveness of a female, but her usual posture and egotistical mindset told me she probably held some genuine value to the unfortunate guys who fell to her seductive practices. "Hi," I said, in a muffled tone, without sparing more than a second to look over. Food was my objective at the time, and I continued to stuff as many syrup-drenched waffles into my mouth as I could. Caring little for the display of immaturity, I'm sure it composed as droplets of syrup coated my shirt. Food dangled from my fork as I swooped under it, trying to drop it into my small mouth. That, more often than not, resulted in the sticky contents of the food coating my... It was silent for too long. I couldn't help but peek out of the corner of my eyes over at the bag of flesh that was certain to be a zombie. The girl's head was now resting on her arms as she sat at the counter in silence. As my curiosity grew, I tried to delve a little into her mind, and a sudden and terrible headache overcame me, along with a gust of confusion. I stopped what I was doing instantly. Not wanting to deal with any form of nausea when it came to eating breakfast, I averted my attention back to the feast before me. Just as I hit the maximum load in terms of consumable food and strings of syrup were drooling out of the corners of my mouth, Kristen came walking into the kitchen. Or was she running? Her aggravated footsteps made for a quick pace like that of a speed walker with the intended purpose of expending numerous excess calories. It was an unusual occurrence in the interior of a home lacking any treadmills. "Derek, you're not missing the bus this time. I'm tired of driving you," Kristen declared as she picked up my backpack and slammed it onto the counter with emphasis. I got the point. And quick. "What, you're allowed to be late and he's not?" laughed the girl on the other stool, who just lightly lifted her head up from her arm, only enough to squeeze out a few words, her droopy eyes squinting as she forced a smile. "Yeah, what the heck?" I questioned aloud, feeling rallied by Kristen's friend taking my side. "You shut up," Kristen said, pointing to her friend, "and you get your ass ready." Arguing with my sister was not something I was down for. She had more in her arsenal than a bold red marker, detention slips, and out-of-school suspensions. She had a palm on her hand that would welt the left side of my face if I didn't make the right choice of words. I slid off the high stool and grabbed the arm strap of my backpack, pulling it off the countertop before throwing it over my shoulder. I was still chewing the insurmountable mounds of food I managed to shove into my mouth as I went to make my way out the door. "Bye, Derek," Kristen's friend said to me. I made an intensive attempt to swallow the food in my mouth. "Bye-bye." My muffled voice barely got out as pieces of food was ejected from my mouth as I tried to speak. Dylan was right there waiting in the back of the bus for me, and without a single grouchy 8th grader in sight. It was going to be a smooth ride ahead. Snap. I looked around. Not too big of a disturbance, I thought. Though now I am down to pencil. After skimming my horizons, I saw not a single writing utensil in sight. Well, nothing in my reaches anyways. I weighed my head left and right all around my desk and even underneath, and not a single pencil in sight. There was a lot of already used gum on the other side of my desk, though. Could be of good use in the future, I thought, but it just wasn't what I needed at the time. I looked over at one of the most proud gold sticker-bearing teacher's pets I had ever seen. She had 3 neatly rolled, finely sharpened, and non-chewed pencils layered in a straight row, ready to be dispensed at her earliest needs. I knew she was too particular and well thought over to drop one of those fine specimens, but that didn't stop me from wishful thinking. I was daunted by them. Not that I was fascinated in neatly lined up pencils by any means, but my stressing needs for a writing utensil had me fixated. I did not want to confess so easily to my irritable teacher that I broke my only writing utensil, as it would only permit her to inflate the cranial arterial vessel she prominently displayed when speaking to me. I licked my lips at the sight of the pencils, as though it was some delicious morsel. That was when the paper came. Pop quiz, everybody. This way I know you did the reading last night, sniveled Mrs. Peterson. The woman was a devil by my terminology, and I found myself daydreaming of cruel, childish pranks that I could someday pull on her. The clean sheet of paper slid down from her recently photocopied pile of pop quizzes as she walked by me with a smirk on her face. The still hot and ink-plastered remnant of a tree landed gracefully on my desk after a sweeping descent. Had the paper had eyes and neatly trimmed brows, I was sure it would have mocked me with taunting looks. I scratched my head as I read the names of characters I didn't even know was in the book I was supposed to read, and now I had to describe them? Better yet, I didn't even know the title of the summer reading book. Instinctively, I turned back to the pencil-hoarding teacher's pet, knowing she'd know the answers to this inconvenient quiz, but she caught on to my quick movements as if expecting them. She turned the corner of her shoulder in my direction to hide the paper, and to keep her well-rehearsed answers to herself. I began to sulk. What an awful way to start the year, I thought. I looked at the broken tip of my pencil and then back at the girl next to me. What a jerk, was all I could say to myself. If I had known the answers to that lame quiz, I would have happily shared them with her, or so I convinced myself. I began fantasizing of potentially mean things I could say to her in the future in order to get her back for this treasonous action, but that was when I mistakenly heard her speak. What was the author of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone? I looked back at the paper before me and saw that the same exact slogan I had just heard was the top line of the quiz. J.K. Rowling. My head quickly shot back at the girl, and I saw her scribble something down on the paper. What year was the book written? She was already on to the next question. I picked up my cracked pencil and used my fingernail to cut out the piece of lead that was inside, digging it out of its holder. The pencil was no good, but I didn't need it. I pinched the small cylinder of lead that fell out of its pocket and wrote the answers onto the paper as they came to me. This quiz I would pass, as I had done with so many in the past. When it was time, I put down my centimeter of lead onto the desk, sat back in my seat, and watched as the overjoyous girl to my side began to rise from her chair. She pressed her paper to her breast as though to keep away any watchful eyes that may snatch one of her invaluable answers during her noble march to the finish line. She had finished the quiz quickly, but so had I, about a fraction of a second after her, to be precise. Mrs. Peterson smiled as the girl came to her desk and politely handed in her quiz with her full name neatly stenciled at the top, and the accurate date placed right beside it. All that shenanigans was just straight up redundant, if you ask me, and so I slapped down my first name at the top of the paper like a broadcasted banner advertising something you don't want in the midst of your television program. I waited. I had to. Otherwise, I was sure suspicion would have risen that I had somehow copied the girl's paper, which wasn't far off from the truth. After the second kid got up to hand his test about a minute later, I decided it was a good time to do so myself. When I arose, however, Mrs. Peterson's sharp eyes looked up from her desk and shot beams of searing anger at me, as though she suspected that I was seconds from performing a radical outburst. Her eyes did not flinch from the entire time I got up to the time I placed the paper onto her desk, except for a minor tweak in her left eye, which I was sure was a sign of a stroke. She quickly scooped my quiz into her correction pile and continued to stare out of the corner of her eyes at me as I made it back to my seat. When I sat down, I did so with pride. I was excited. A great change of events having gone from potentially bombing a quiz to absolutely acing it. I knew this because the moment I got back to my seat, Mrs. Peterson was gazing over my exam, relaying the same expression of shock she had only days ago when she asked me to answer the blackboard equation. Everything was correct. The girl to my side looked away with a raised chin, feeling insulted that I had finished the quiz much earlier than she had predicted. That and the smile she saw across my face when I looked her way may have given away the fact that she played a viable role in my early finish. She was the very reason I passed that quiz, after all. I didn't let her negative mood get to me. She turned her back to me and I shrugged it off. I passed, and that's all I cared about. I threw my hand in her direction in a dismissive gesture and sat back in my seat. My head rested in my hands composed up behind my head as I looked over again at her and her neatly organized pencils. It hurt a little sometimes, when others thought poorly about me. I straightened my head as I wanted to get my mind away from her, instead closing my eyes and fixating on the organized pencils, conjuring images of her colorful school equipment falling apart and visualizing the sense of humility she would feel. How could she think so poorly about me after something like that happened? I willed it, thinking it over and over, visualizing it as I clenched my eyes closed. That was when the clattering of her pencils bouncing off the solid floor had resounded throughout the room. I turned to see her picking them up in haste, as though she had great concern over the fact that they may have been dirtied in the act. She also seemed alarmed at the idea that the pencils managed to fall out of her ordered rows, and a great sense of embarrassment overcame her. Mrs. Peterson had finished reading over my quiz and looked up at me for a second before slamming the paper into her pile, disappointed that I was seemingly passing her class without contributing to her open discussions at all. How does he do it? She wondered aloud. It was the first question she proposed that I didn't have the answer to. I passed that quiz with the highest possible score that only one other student in the classroom had also achieved. I straightened my head as I wanted to get my mind away from her, instead closing my eyes and fixating on the organized pencils, conjuring images of her colorful school equipment falling apart and visualizing the sense of humility she would feel. How could she think so poorly about me after something like that happened? I willed it, thinking it over and over, visualizing it as I clenched my eyes closed. That was when the clattering of her pencils bouncing off the solid floor had resounded throughout the room. I turned to see her picking them up in haste, as though she had great concern over the fact that they may have been dirtied in the act. She also seemed alarmed at the idea that the pencils managed to fall out of her ordered rows, and a great sense of embarrassment overcame her. Mrs. Peterson had finished reading over my quiz and looked up at me for a second before slamming the paper into her pile, disappointed that I was seemingly passing her class without contributing to her open discussions at all. How does he do it? She wondered aloud. It was the first question she proposed that I didn't have an answer to. I passed that quiz with the highest score possible that only one other student in the classroom had achieved. Out of all the words in the dictionary language, I could not find one that thoroughly explains my joy and love for food. I hear about it again and again from my sister, who says that she had wished dearly that she had my metabolism, and that I was very lucky to have it, though I never quite grasped her excessive concern for physical appearance. My love for food was undying, but it wasn't the same anymore. Food just wasn't the same. I used to fly out of class, speed past other kids like a jacked-up track runner imported from some far-off exotic country just to get a few spaces further in the lunch line. Now, on this day, I decided to skip lunch altogether. At first, I thought it was the middle school's new variation of food, but I registered that notion as foolish, as it was clearly an improvement from the styrofoam inflatable nuggets they served daringly entitled chicken back in the old elementary school. I knew what it was causing the problem, like many things, but it wasn't easy to understand. I'm with him, I told the lunch lady as she asked what I was having. You're not eating again? Dylan asked. No, not hungry. Besides, I had my sister's waffles this morning. I jokingly gagged. Still sick from those. I would have had your sister's waffles. I shoved him for that one. Right into the kid to his side and nearly caused a domino effect throughout the entire line. I didn't know what he meant by that. In fact, he didn't either. But he deserved it nonetheless. It was a stupid joke, handed down by older classmen without any real context to it. But it was seemingly funny to our hardly developed level of maturity. Jokes didn't have to have any meaning behind them at this age. We sat down at one of the round lunch tables outside the cram-packed trenches we called lunch lines. The tables took some getting used to, as they had us sit at rectangular tables all throughout the first and second grade, and now our entire world was flipped upside down with these new spherical variants. I didn't know what the meaning behind this rapid change in the environment, but I was sure it had something to do with the introduction of pie in the math classes. Speaking of pie, the plump face of an 8th grader who had far too many sweets, but still was as sour as a freshly picked grapefruit, appeared right in front of me. That is my seat, he said to me. It was the poor and unforgiving soul who got a seat taken from him on the bus, and without being much better at things in life than squashing small little 6th graders between his gritty, greasy-layered fingers, he came back for retaliation. I had a feeling he didn't really care for a seat, but I offered one anyways. Take that one, I said, pointing at an empty seat nearby, trying to find a reasonable solution for him. I had a desire, as always, to make some kind of comedic gain out of the situation, but the clear and evident threats that he posed had me nervous, and I wanted to settle his aggression as easily as possible. Take it, I said sharply, stepping out of the table and kicking the chair in his direction. I was done with him. I didn't want any trouble. I could see what he was capable of. My words were spoken with such force he instinctively picked up the chair and turned around before stopping on his heel in confusion. There weren't many people who would stop after I said something like that. I can't really say why, as I was probably as intimidating as I was sweet, and my middle school form wasn't all that sweet at all. People always listened. This one, however, did not. He turned around as if puzzled as to why he actually took the chair in the first place. This caused him to drop it at his feet. I saw he was coming for me. His long steps around the chair meant he wanted nothing more than to pile drive a body to the ground, and I happened to be his target. I was already backing away, bumping into chairs behind me, when his hands reached for my shirt and I defensively smacked them away. If I came home with another ripped shirt, my sister Kristen would do a lot more damage than this punk could do. I found that strangely on my mind. Go away, I shouted. The 8th grader paused for a moment and robotically dropped his hands to his side. His eyes glazed over and he turned on his heels before heading in the other direction. Just like before, after taking a few steps in the direction opposing me, he stopped in his tracks and was questioning his actions. He turned to face me for the second time. This was not going to plan. I felt it come. Adrenaline is what most people would have called it, but it just wasn't the same. I had never fought a single soul in my life, but I had a feeling such a conflict was about to come, as the onrush of a hostile body approached my side just out of view. Blood flowed through my limbs with dramatic effect and brought a strange sense of invulnerability, a feeling that was truly exhilarating. It was a sensation I had never felt before. I was aware of it all, the synaptic firings of my nerves, the mental registering of the 5 senses, and even the expansion of my mind as it called for a help far beyond this world. I saw it all coming, but I was too in awe to care. The pudgy 8th grader's friend threw his arms out as he ran at me and shoved me into a lunch table crowded with other students. He was big all right, and his superior body weight threw me a good distance. I crashed into a few seated students and nearly collapsed the table I partly landed on. Food was catapulted by the pressure placed unevenly to one side of the table, and condiments carpeted my clothing. I noticed the floor ahead was decorated in pebbles of preservative-rich sauces as I climbed up from the ground, feeling the numbing vibrations in my limbs. The 2 kids under me were hurt, and I could distantly feel the formation of their bruises, the unsuspecting pain in their minds. Their anguish was discomforting, and wrenched at me like their wounds were my own. But it was an ambience that I could shoo away if I so chose. As for me, I was perfectly fine, and was already standing back up. It was as though I was walking through dozens of historical battlefields at once. Millions of different experiences coruscated before my eyes, all filled with endless emotions and exhaustion, glories and triumphs, turmoils and tragedies. The efforts, the failures, and the successions of every life were laid before me, and I drank from it like a fountain in a much-desired need for hydration. I felt as though I stood in a field of great sacrifice, where the ambitions of man had fallen short, and the invigorating effort of a single defiant soul in a world enshrouded in doubt lingered on the path of exile. That, however, wasn't where I was at all. I stood in the center of Keller Middle School's lunchroom with a very large, onlooking crowd. The angry sidekick from the bully, who stood roughly 3 times my size, came running forward, unsatisfied with the damage he had already caused in the lunchroom. He wound his big fist up into the air and over his shoulder like he was planning on putting it right into my relatively straight set of teeth. My body continued to walk forward despite the lack of any mental provocations. I refused to resist. Perhaps, if I just let go and let my instinctual mind take over, things would be okay. In anticipation of the strike, my left arm came across my body in a swift and well-practiced motion, throwing the 5th grader's fist wide and opening his body for attack. The momentum from the parry traveled through my limbs, one arm to the other, and drove a slingshot-like force into my right arm, and the palm of my hand crashed into the face of the 8th grader. The impact was loud, and I felt the shudder that waked through the lunchroom as a result of the concussive blow. The aggressor's eyes rolled back into his head as his body flopped onto the hard surface of the floor, and his conscience was thrown into the back of his head. Without thought, I rested on my right heel before spinning sharply and striking the backside of my fist into the cheekbone of the other oncoming 8th grader, the original sobbing seat theft victim. He too felt the harsh blackness of unconscious as his body crashed to the floor of the room with a strong concluding thud. His recollection of the day's events would be incapable of properly comprehending the force that had annihilated both his friend and himself in mere seconds apart. In fact, that very force was reconstructing his entire memory of the events as he lay dormant. The silence of the lunchroom was felt more than it was heard. It was actually quite peaceful, besides the quick shuffling of distant lunch aides who scurried to my position. All the conversations that were being shared within the lunchroom was immediately dropped and forgotten, as everyone's will to eat had halted, but for a moment, just to witness what had happened. Most hadn't even been quick enough to catch the action. All they saw was a small, brown-haired sixth grader in an oversized t-shirt who stared dumbfounded at the ground to his side, where two infamous bullies lay. Here I was again, all eyes drawn to me, and I didn't have a single word to say.